Good afternoon, Erica. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so pleased to have you. I listen to your Self-Kind podcast all the time, and I think it's right up our alley to sort of help our listeners support themselves, particularly through those huge life challenges and stress. So I thought I'd start with you touching on, what the impacts of stress can have on our body, and some of the things, the baseline things that we can sort of do to keep functioning.
Yes. Well, it can feel like we're at the risk of not functioning when we're in really high stress, for sure. And I guess that's sort of one place to start, is like the physical impact of those crisis stress response. I guess the place that I would start with an explanation around that is a recognition that your brain is always trying to keep you safe. And so your brain obviously controlling your body as well. And so we will feel the impact of stress physically as well as mentally. And the reaction that we have to stress is very useful. Often we talk about stress as being this awful thing, and it can be very awful in the sense that it can lead us to feel quite poorly for a really long period of time. But stress is very adaptive. It serves a purpose that is very clear. And that purpose is to maintain our safety. And so it gives us the resources, right? We know this, that when we're stressed, we get the resources to do what we need to do in order to extract ourselves from that situation. The challenge that we have in our modern day lives is that often that stress is inescapable, in the sense that it is prolonged. It is, if it's something like financial stress, that faces us every single day. If it's the illness of a loved one, there is no resolution to that in the short term. And certainly brings up other issues in the long term. And so we have this situation where the impact of stress doesn't resolve the way that it would if we were out in the wild, hunting our dinner. And the adrenaline rush that we get, or the hormone cascade that we get, that is super helpful if we need to run away from something or run towards something, suddenly doesn't have anywhere to go, because we're not running from anything, and it's still there when we wake up tomorrow. And so we might have, the physical impact of tight muscles, poor digestion. We might feel a little bit breathless, or like we can't take a deep breath. We might experience anxiety. We could go down the kind of more frozen response and feel quite depressed, or low mood, like we don't really want to do stuff that used to be fun. And we can mentally feel quite confused. I guess confused isn't quite the word I want to use, but the anxiety, right? The kind of like, I feel like I need to run from something, but I'm not sure how, because there's no clear pathway to resolve this stress. So when it comes to managing that kind of stress, the thing that I guess is really important is to recognize that because that stress doesn't have a resolution, it's not like the bear is going to disappear and then suddenly we're like, well, we're safe now. Because that stress kind of continues to loom, we have to be proactive in tending to ourselves and our body through practices that are really accessible given the realities of our lives, that help us to close that loop of stress every day, so that our body isn't in that constant state of trying to respond to a stress that currently can't be resolved. Yeah. Is that a reasonable introduction?
So much of a great explanation, actually. And it really just sort of eases people into understanding that, yes, it does serve a purpose, but, I love thinking about closing off the loop. And I've been very conscious of that myself for a long time, particularly just movement to get the hormones out of the system, because otherwise they're just stagnant, and then you're going to bed with all these hormones everywhere, and of course your brain can't relax when you're pumped. So
and even thinking about it from the point of view of some of this stuff also, depending on what the situation is, and I don't know if you want to bring up a particular example that people might be dealing with, but depending on the situation, a lot of the stress itself is coming from our thoughts about it. Right? Because we can't, it's not that it's necessarily right there in front of us, the way that like a bear chasing us might be. I don't know why I'm using bear today, but you know what I mean? Something threatening right there in front of us. The thought processes of like, this is the thing that's happening, or the self-criticism that goes along with that. That's a huge piece, especially for high achieving kind of perfectionist kind of driven people. We can often be quite self-critical about the fact that we're like not managing our stress very well. And that itself then perpetuates the stress response, because we can, you know, the stress response isn't just triggered by things that are happening outside of us. It's triggered by the things that we think as well. So we know we can work ourselves up into quite a frenzy by just imagining certain scenarios, right? And so the physical response to stress is not reliant on a physical trigger to stress. It can also be triggered by our thinking. And so having ways to both impact the physical impact of stress, but also giving our mental processes a bit of a break, so that we have methods for cutting through or quieting down or replacing those stress-inducing thoughts is really important. So that's kind of why, you know, my approach is very much body-mind based. It's not just body and it's not just mind, because there is kind of like this infinite loop that happens between the two, where what we're thinking affects how we feel and how we feel affects how we think. And so we have to go, I think, through both doorways in order to really feel like we have the capacity to manage the symptoms and outcomes of that stress.
And I mean, what you were saying before as well about the effects of prolonged stress, and it was sort of this, it was the lack of clarity that can sometimes form as well as part of the prolonged stress. And then, as you said, then there's the self-critical and there's the judgment, and then it compounds, doesn't it? So,
oh yeah.
So I mentioned before that, you know, I'm very conscious of physical activity. So physically moving your body, as you're talking about with the connection, with the mind-body connection, does there actually have a really positive impact if you're moving your body for the mental side of the stress and the calming of the mind as well? How does that work?
It can, yeah, absolutely. And there's probably some science there that I can't draw upon right this moment off the top of my head. But I mean, we know that physical activity can have very similar effects to antidepressants, in the sense that, and, you know, I say that and I'm like, I want to have a study to tell you, you know, to point you in the direction of, because I don't like giving you just like random claims. But there are studies and information out there that, you know, we know that mental health is affected by physical activity. We know that. What I would say though, from that point of view, is that one of the beautiful things about movement, especially when we engage in mindful movement, is that the mental health impact of that, or the impact on our thinking process, is that we start to shift our focus away from necessarily what we're thinking, into sensation and noticing how we feel. And that helps us to create a more compassionate relationship with our body and with ourselves. And that, to me, is actually key in all of this, is the ability to meet ourselves with compassion and kindness. Because when we are suffering, which is what is happening when we are stressed, we are suffering in some way, to meet ourselves with criticism or shame or blame or guilt doesn't help us out of that. What helps us out of that is self-compassion and recognizing, hey, you're suffering right now and you are still worthy of love and support in that moment, right? And so to me, yes, we could go down the pathway of talking about all the sort of chemical and hormonal impacts of exercise on the brain. Totally, yes. But I think a really interesting kind of element of that is the way that it allows us to actually embody ourselves, meet ourselves, and build that muscle of self-compassion, which is, it sounds kind of trite in some ways, perhaps, but it is not easy, necessarily, not for everyone. But it's transformative, because suddenly your body becomes a safer place to be. Because this is the thing, when we're stressed, you know, if we come back to this idea of like your brain is just trying to keep you safe. And so then it's going to impact your body in a way that allows you to get to safety or, you know, maintain safety. If the internal environment is such that you are creating a sense of criticism and shame and blame and stuff on the inside, then we can only go so far with creating that sense of safety from external things. Being your own kind of ally, being your own companion in your self-care and in your sort of relationship with yourself is where the gold is, in my opinion. I think that that's probably a place where we overlook it because it sort of is a little bit wishy-washy. You know, there's an element of like, but what is that really? Like, how can you bottle that? Can you sell that? Like, how do you do that? But I genuinely think that's the thing that can transform our reality for so many of us.
Yeah. I mean, we often pride ourselves sometimes as being a biggest critic, but then it's also our downfall, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I often talk about, as you said, you know, the high achieving people, I like to say, you know, they're otherwise empowered, but then, you know, you hit some kind of crisis and they're just like spilled out all over the floor. Like, where are all the resources that I usually call on? Because I'm so hard on myself and this is just too much.
And I think that this is the thing, is that two things can be the same, like two things can be true at the same time, right? So you can be, you can set your expectations high and you can kind of have these strengths and these resources that can be really valuable. And they can also be detrimental in certain circumstances. So I don't think that it's ever quite so binary. You know, it's not like, well, you either have to be super soft on yourself all the time, or you know, you're going to be kind of critical and whatever. I don't think it's that clear cut. There is a huge value in being, you know, so many of the, I'm sure so many of the women listening, they have gotten to where they are because they have expectations on themselves that exceed perhaps what the world expected, right? And so it's not like it's all bad. It's not like it's like, well, you have to change who you are in order to be this person who can meet themselves with compassion. That would be a big ask, you know, but it's recognizing that sometimes then we need to meet that tendency with something else that allows us to kind of temper what we need at the time, you know. I mean, I'm a really hard worker and high achiever and have high expectations on myself as well. And I meet myself with so much compassion every day, noticing that sometimes that will send me a little too close to the edge of running out of steam, you know, and kind of being who I want to be in the world and showing up for a life that is, you know, my making. So yeah, never really binary in that regard.
Yeah. But I think as well, what you're drawing on too is a lot more presence and focus than sometimes a lot of people will have. Because you're also talking before, and I know that I do this a lot, you know, on my list of things to do is the exercise, the stretching, all those things. And so I'm doing them because they're on my list and they're not part of being self-care, and I'm not even present while I'm doing them. I'm actually doing a million other things in my head while I'm doing my exercise.
Yeah, but just tick them off the list.
Yeah, that's right. And yet, I think, as you were sort of saying before, you know, actually being in your body and feeling what you're feeling and being aware of your breathing and your what you are stretching or working on at a particular time, and being mindful is actually the key in the things that we're doing as part of the self-care, instead of just going, yeah, I'm doing my self-care, you know, taking my supplements, I'm running, I'm stretching.
Yeah, and I think that's a real risk for and I put myself in this category. So when I say this, I don't mean like all those people out there. That's a real risk for those of us who are trying to do a lot, right? Who are like, I've got big dreams, I've got goals, I've got whatever. It is a real risk that we just put the right things on our list and we tick them off. And what I always say to that is that we're working from like the wrong foundation when we do that. We're working from this foundation of like, there are right things to do. And simply the action of doing them is where the value lies. But in my opinion, when it comes to self-care, the more helpful foundation is a desire to have a kind, loving, respectful relationship with your body. Because then that's going to be a very different reason to show up for self-care, and it's going to bring a very different quality to the execution of that self-care than simply being like, well, I did my yoga today, Whereas when we show up to a yoga mat like, well, I just got to get through this because then I've got to go, that's very different to being like, wow, what an opportunity to like meet myself with kindness today, to nurture myself, to have this opportunity to hit pause in the middle of what was a really busy day and to check in and notice, like, how am I feeling? What do I need? What might I need later? And the activity stays the same, but how it feels makes all the difference. And I think this kind of was something I stumbled on through personal experience when I was having a really hard time and I was doing the motions. I was trying to tick my way through the list and I felt worse than I did before. And I was like, but I'm doing the things. How is it possible that I feel worse, not better? And it was because my reasons for doing it were almost punitive. It was almost like a punitive approach to like being a better person. And that was just like, whoa, what a smack in the face that was when I realized what I was doing. And so that shift towards, no, hang on, I choose to have a kind and loving and responsive and respectful relationship with myself and my body. That becomes a replacement for motivation for a start, but it also just changes the quality of the things that you engage in, because no longer are you ticking off a list, no longer are you working through this sort of shamey model of like, you should do all these things. You suddenly have this freedom to be like, how am I really? And what is it that I actually need? Not just the yoga class because it's what's on the list. Maybe I just like need to go to bed early. Maybe I need another glass of water. Maybe I need to call a friend. Maybe I need to say no to that appointment tomorrow because my resources are used up. It gives us a different baseline to work from.
And I love that you're bringing in that you've recently had some challenges, and you've spoken about it on your own podcast as well. Because I'd like to sort of touch on, particularly because you're so wise and you have all these things as a daily practice and you know this stuff, and yet for even yourself, it sort of went out the window a little bit. So how did you bring it back in and call on it when it was most needed? What did you draw on and how did you bring it back and actually make it work?
Yeah. So that time that I just referred to was probably a good decade ago. And I think that it's a good example, because there's been something else more recently, but I think it was a good example of the mindset shift that I'd had before this happened, right? So for a little bit of context for the people who are listening, my mum has frontotemporal dementia, which is a really awful form of dementia. They're all terrible. And she just recently had to be moved into an aged care home. And very confronting. I don't feel like I'm at that stage of life yet. It was pretty awful. And because of the way that her illness is, she can't talk. She doesn't know who I am. There's all these things around this. And it was very grief laden, and there was guilt associated with, her having to go into a home. So there's all this stuff going on, and it was busy, right? Because I was doing the bulk of the legwork on that project, that's not the word, but you know what I mean, the process of getting that to happen. And so it was probably, and this is very recent, right? So as I talk about it, I might be a little bit like up and down in terms of how clear it is, because it's very recent. What I was really clear on, though, was that because over that past decade, I have really shifted my relationship with self-care and with myself from being one of punishment and one of just trying to like be good into something that actually was intended to be nurturing. It meant that the lens that I looked through for self-care was very different. Now, I didn't do a lot in that period of time. There was probably a period of time of about a month where like normally I would walk every day. Normally I would do some sort of other movement every day. And I didn't do much of it, right? But what I did have was access to things like my breath, access to little tiny movement snacks is what I like to call them, but little moments of pausing and moving. that I was very willing to just insert into my day in imperfect ways, because my expectation wasn't to sort of achieve anything kind of concrete, in the sense that, like, I didn't put the expectation on myself to do like an hour of yoga. I didn't put the expectation on myself to like go and have a massage, because I knew I just didn't have the time or the space to actually really make that happen.
Yeah.
But every night, you know, I do this little lymphatic massage on my body, and every night, pretty much, not without fail, there were some exceptions, I would do that. And it would be this little moment of pause to be like, this is important to me. This helps me to feel good. And it's a little moment of pause to kind of just be present to what I'm doing. And I would stop, you know, sometimes before bed, I would lie at the foot of the bed, like on the floor, and just do a few movements that would sort of start to shift the pain out of my shoulders, because that's where I hold a lot of my tension.
Yeah.
I would breathe, I would do all of those things, but in these small moments, you know, a couple of minutes here, a couple of minutes there, and grounding in a recognition that it was fine to be imperfect. And I didn't feel as good in that period of time that I did before, and that I know I did after. But I think we have, you know, that acceptance of the fact that sometimes life will simply be more complicated, and we can't expect ourselves to have a perfect self-care routine, but it doesn't mean that we can't do anything. Because I think this is the risk, right? We go into this, we go into life kind of thinking, well, we have to get it all right, or we may as well not bother. And when it comes to self-care, if our foundation is one of, I just simply want to be able to be responsive to my needs, I want to be able to be kind and loving towards myself, we can do that in small moments. It actually doesn't require us to show up for an hour of anything, really. I mean, we can, that might be something that we choose to do, but it's less event driven and more kind of introspective, I guess. It's kind of like that question of what is it that I need? So I think very much of those small decisions that we make throughout the day as being almost a little bit more important than the, you know, 1 hour of yoga that we might book in for Thursday afternoon. You know, when we get off this call, like, I can feel that my shoulders are a little tight because I had a session before this, and, you know, now my body's like, can we do something other than sitting? So I'll probably like lie on the floor for a couple of minutes and roll around. And then I'll move on with my day. I'm not going to take, you know, another hour to do that right now. But it's these little moments of choice, knowing that we've got access to tools like our breath, movement, grounding, just checking in, that make so much more of an impact than we would think, based on the short amount of time that they take and the complete lack of external, you know, resources that it requires. They're just there, right? And I think when we start to understand our body and how our brain and our body communicate and interact, we recognize that, oh, this actually does make a difference. It's not like just a thing to tick off. I'm having a direct impact on my nervous system. I'm having a direct impact on how my brain is now perceiving my world. And so I think, I think I'm waffling now, but there is just so much value in understanding ourselves and understanding what information we can access to then make choices about how do I engage in self-care that meets me in the reality of my life. Because if we are thinking, well, it has to look like this, and until my life is simple enough for that to be the case, we'll never do it, because life will always expand to fill our time. You know, it just doesn't work. We so often hear ourselves say that, oh, well, when this is over, I'll be able to get back to that. And it's like, well, probably, maybe not.
So true, so true. Do you think that because of the mind-body connection as well, that you know, instead of trying to force things mentally, you know, the doing something physical can be your access point to being able to change then the mental state, in terms of the thinking as well? Because we were talking before about those horrible cycling thoughts, and then becoming aware of that, and then just trying to tackle the cycling thoughts directly through more mental effort. You know, some people might be able to do that. And of course, I know that you do some counseling work as well, but you've certainly got the body connection in there too. Do you find that it, bringing both together, you see the benefits and the, you know, more effectiveness?
100%. And I think part of the reason why is I often thought about my early time with movement, and I sort of started just with yoga, and now it's much broader than that. But I started with yoga, and to me, that was my doorway in, was through the body. My doorway to my mind was through my body. And part of the reason was because, again, it gives you a way to shift your focus. It gives you a way to shift your attention onto something that's quite concrete. So, oh, I can notice my big toe on the floor. Oh, when I stretch my leg out, I feel this sense of, pulling or tightness or whatever. Oh, that's interesting. My right shoulder, like it just gives us something to anchor onto. It gives us something to be aware of. But it also, I think, starts to help us see that what we're thinking affects how we feel. And that's really key, I think, because I'm sure that there's plenty of us walking around not recognizing that the way that we talk to ourselves has an impact on the fact that our shoulders feel like they're constantly, in our ears. But it does. And so through the process of reconnecting with movement and with our body, it gives us, a doorway to a little bit more peace in terms of the thought processes, but also more capacity perhaps, or greater opportunity to be in tune with what's actually there, because a lot of those thought processes just run on autopilot. They're not things that you're even necessarily conscious of. And until you can embody yourself, that might stay the case. There's one of the modalities that I teach is called somatic exercise. And this idea of the soma is really cool, because it's this concept that we are in a unique position, which we all are, to feel our experience from the inside out. And that experience incorporates more than just our physicality. It incorporates, we all know there's some mornings that you wake up and you're like, I just don't have it today. I'm just, whatever it might be, I'm tired and I'm grumpy and I'm these things. And to look at us from the outside, nobody might have any information about that, right? Unless you're scowling or something. But to understand that our experience, if we're in our soma, right, this idea of like body-mind connection, that we're then using all of that information to make decisions about how we proceed. And so, that's where our self-care becomes very responsive. It can be proactive as well, in the sense that, I know yoga makes me feel better, and so I'm going to make sure I incorporate that. But it can also be really responsive, because on that day, maybe you had planned a 5K walk, and suddenly you're like, there's just something in me that I think I need to lie on the floor and roll around. The walk doesn't seem like the right thing. And so it becomes less of a checkbox ticking and more of a checking in process, or a little bit of both. It can be a little bit of both as well. But I do think that the physical doorway is often much more accessible for people, because we don't always know what's going on in our minds. We can't always zoom in on it. And there will almost always be a physical manifestation of whatever it is that's going on in our head anyway. And so we can go at it from either way. And sometimes, and when I work with people one-on-one, we usually go at it from both. And it is super effective, because then we have tools for meeting both needs, because the needs are not always the same. And so, I love it. I could just talk forever, so I'll stop.
Tell us about Self-Kind then, and tell us where people can find what you do and how you do it and how they can work with you.
Yeah. So as Jackie said, I have a podcast which is called Self-Kind with Erica Webb, and you can listen to that anywhere that you find podcasts. I also work with people one-on-one. So as you mentioned, Jackie, I'm a counselor, a registered counselor, as well as a movement coach. And so when I work with people one-on-one, it's very much dependent on the person in the room. And so, the virtual room or the physical room, sometimes it is just talk therapy. Sometimes it is very much working through the thoughts and, being heard, giving people space to be heard. But what I'm often doing in that process is opening opportunities or spotting opportunities for moments for that individual to then notice, oh, how does that impact how I'm feeling? And so, and then for others, there's a lot of movement, a lot of breathing, a lot of repatterning things that perhaps don't feel like they're functioning the way that you want them to at the moment. So I work a lot with people who experience like chronic tension, a lot of, muscular kind of aches and pains, and anxiety and self-criticism,
Yes.
lots of that. And I also do movement classes. So there's a little bit of everything in there, but the movement classes that I run, it's also called Self-Kind. So it's called the Self-Kind Hub. And they're movement classes that incorporate all of this stuff that we've talked about around self-compassion, around meeting yourself with respect rather than kind of just those shoulds and expectations. And so they're movement classes that are very mindful, very slow, very gentle, but targeting chronic tension and those self-critical kind of tendencies that a lot of us have.
I'm not sure I understand.
Siri thinks I'm talking to her. She never answers me when I need her, but she'll just pop up when I'm like not talking to her.
Like life.
Yeah, exactly right. I used to get embarrassed when that happened. Now I'm like, nah, that's not, I can't control that. So yes, always pulling in any way that you sort of connect with me, whether it's through the podcast, on Instagram, which you can find me, Erica Webb _self-kind. It always comes back to this idea of self-kindness and compassion. And that underpins everything that I do, whether it's, talk-based counseling or movement or a combination of both. So yeah, and I love to connect. So if people have questions or, just want to say hi, come and find me over on Instagram. That's usually the best place to find me, or my website, which is ericawebb.com.au.
Yeah, your Instagram's wonderful as well, but I just love your podcast.
Thank you.
And the other thing I love about your movement classes is that you're so explicit that like it's not just movement. Like there is
really want people to understand that.
That's right. There is a bigger meaning here. So yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you again for your time, Erica. It's been so wonderful.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's been a ball.